Well, howdy. I've been traveling back up the old Great Western Cattle Trail, reliving some of the places from my earlier adventures. Like a lot of my craft, I served with the Southern Arms in the late unpleasantness of 1861. After the war, we come home to a ruined country. Money was scarce, everybody was poor, but there was plenty of them wild longhorn cattle. And cow hunting became a new industry, and later cow trailing became an industry to bring the cattle to markets. I trailed them mossy horn steers up the trail with Captain Lytle and other drovers more times than I want to count. We'd make up a herd down in the Nueces Strip country or accept a herd from one of the big cattlemen that was bringing them and start them on the long tramp northward. There weren't no regular trails in the lower country back then, so we'd just work them north up till we got to near San Antonio, where all of the trails blent together to form a wide cattle trail, sometimes 75 yards wide, that was known then as the Dodge City Fort Griffin Trail, the Western Trail, and the Great Western Trail. We'd go in the spring when the country was swarded with grass and flowers, and water, though scarce, could be had every day for at least a day. With 6 men on each side, we'd take the herd up north, and it'd be strung out for 3/4 of a mile like an army in loose marching order, or some mythical serpent or Chinese dragon. 2 men, known as point men, up at the front would ride out and back, and in doing so keep the cattle pointed in the right direction. Men on each side, known as swing men, rode out from the herd to keep the cattle from straying too far or keeping wild range cattle from coming into the herd. As we passed San Antonio, our trail boss and cook would go into town for provisions, but the rest of us would keep the herd going on northward. Our chuck wagon was the rolling castle of the plains, and the chuck wagon cook its emperor. A good cook could make a herd and a cattle drive go well, but a bad cook was something to endure. He was known as the cook, koozie, cocinero, biscuit shooter, and a bunch of other names that you probably can't say here. And the territory between his wagon and the fire was his prime territory, and nobody violated it. The story is told of a drive where it was cold, and there was one young puncher that was green and didn't know the etiquette of the chuck wagon, and he got on the cook's side. He wasn't supposed to be over there. The rest of the drovers was all lined up on their side of the fire, and the cook was on his side of the fire. The young puncher got up and walked over and sat down by the cook. Nobody said a word. Cook didn't say a word. He just got up, went to the wagon, got his spade, and whacked that young puncher over the head and drug him back around to his side of the fire. He had broke the rules. He had violated the etiquette. Life like that gave us a kind of a code to live by. Some fool writer later on called it the Code of the West. But it was good rules, things like don't borrow a horse without permission. Don't whip or kick another man's horse. When you're approaching a man on horseback, you might offer a friendly greeting, but don't wave. You don't want to scare the other man's horse. If the other man gets down off of his horse, well, you're obliged to get down as well, so you're on equal footing. Don't ever take control of the other man's horse, because that implies taking control if you're holding his bridle. Never get too close to a skunk or a banker. Always close the gate behind you. And if you're going to the chuck wagon, get up there, get your plate and your cup, get your fill, and get out of the way so that other men can get theirs. Rules like that and that kind of etiquette gave our craft a code that we could live by and go on up the trails. Now, our craft did dearly love to get into the towns that we could go along the trail, although there weren't that many of them. Some of them that come to mind are places like Fort Griffin, Doan's Crossing, Dodge City, Ogallala. At Fort Griffin, Lottie Deno had a bunch of soil doves, and gamblers of every description flocked in there and could separate a young drover from what little cash money he had if he wasn't careful. It was at Fort Griffin that Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday began their lifelong friendship. But when we'd get up to Doan's Crossing on the Red River, we just about knowed we had it made. Doan's. Mr. Doan's had the store where we could re-outfit. They had a restaurant called the Bat Cave Cafe and the Cowboy Saloon where a drover could take his whiskey over a proper bar or maybe steal a dance with the bells of Doan's. It was quite a place. Doan's wasn't like Dodge City or places. Doan's had bloodless gunfights. They tell the story of when two men spilled out of the Cowboy Saloon. One, a big man named Bigelow with a wooden leg, and the other man spilt out the other door, a little wiry, nervous fella, and they drew their pistols and went to shooting at each other. Bigelow stuck his peg leg in the ground and was firing at the other fella, and that little wiry fella was jumping around so much and firing back that neither one of them hit anything. And after they got emptied their pistols, they went back in the saloon and went to drinking together. Now, after we'd crossed the Red River, we'd get into the Indian Territory when we crossed the Two Forks. And, you know, life on the trails was tough. There at Doan's one time, there were 33,000 head of cattle that were waiting to cross and take their turn when the river was down while they were re-outfitting. A thunderstorm come up, and it took 120 drovers 10 days to gather all those 33,000 head of cattle off of the prairie and off the river bottom where they'd scattered and reorganize and get their herds pointed north again. It could be that way. Sometimes life was guitars and whiskey, and the next minute your life was in danger. Old Teddy Blue Abbott tells about the time a young drover got out in front of a stampede, and the next morning we went to look for him, and they couldn't find him at all. And they finally found, looked like the remains of his horse and the handle of his six-shooter down amongst some prairie dog holes. And everything else was squashed flatter than a pancake. Well, they tried to think that the lightning got him, and that's what they told his family when they rode him down to Henrietta, Texas about it. But I'm afraid it weren't the lightning. That horse had gone down before the stampede in one of them prairie dog holes and got him trampled to death. Going across the Indian Territory, we'd had no really way to find our way other than to keep the Wichita Mountains to our right and watch the stars. At night, the cookie would point his chuck wagon tongue to the North Star, and that was our map. We'd trade a few beeves with the natives, but sometimes it could be a tough drive across the Indian nations till we got to Fort Supply, and we'd re-outfit there. But the drovers and the herds weren't quite as welcome there as you might think. Then later on, we got to Dodge City, the queen of the cow towns. Now, I've been in Dodge every year since '77, and I can give you folks some pointers. When you go in there, you've got to be careful. Many a bad man has tried to challenge the peace officers and the law in Dodge City, and every protest is met with the death of someone. You may ride into some other towns of shooting and carrying on, but you don't ride into Dodge shooting. You omit that. When you get to Dodge, you check your weapons at the first livery or business house or saloon you see and go on about your business. Our trail boss would meet us in town in Dodge and give us each $25 because he knew better than to give us all of our wages at once. And we'd scatter like partridges before the gunner. And soon we'd come back with our pockets filled with cartridges and needles and thread and tobacco, and every mother's son of us reflecting the art of the barber. One young puncher had his blonde mustaches waxed black and curled like a French dancing master. If we were finished at Dodge, well, we'd go on back, but otherwise a lot of the herds would push on to Ogallala or on to the Indian nations up to Fort Fetterman or Fort Robinson or Montana. Water would be scarcer going up north of Dodge City, but we made it. And finally we would cross the hill, and there in the valley of the Platte we would see the twinkling lights of Ogallala. the Gomorrah of the plains. We'd set camp, but there wasn't many people sleeping that night, because as soon as the night herd was set, the trail boss and the rest of us would go to town. The trail boss would cash a draft, for he was as cashless as anybody else, but his marker was good anywhere along the trail. And we'd draw about $25 and scatter like wild geese. Ogallala wasn't like Dodge City. The law officers there pretty much let things go and everything went. It was a wide open place. From 100 buildings, not a single church spire went upward. We hadn't been there 5 minutes till a horse race broke out in town. The place suited us. Them that wasn't going on to Montana or the North Country would shuck our clothes, draw our wages, get on the train and work our way back to Texas. And in that manner, we made the droves that rescued Texas from the economic depression after the war between the states and made us a craft that we could be proud of. It was hard work, plain fare, good appetites, good friends, and long days of people that worked together. Now, I've never forgotten the feel of the old saddle, the pull of the 6-shooter, or what a comfort the old yellow slicker was to the cowmen of the day. Mr. Sanders and some other men have formed the Old Time Trail Drivers Association and organizing the records right here in San Antonio to keep the record straight of the old trail drivers. And I wish to say that any movement to keep the history of the old trail drives, the cattlemen and the cattle drovers, is a good one. All hail and best wishes to you all, and may your trails be happy, your grass be tall, and your drives be safe. Adios.